Imagine a land, untouched, unexplored, belonging to no empire. Now imagine that same land, just 500 years later, becoming the most powerful nation on Earth. How does that happen? How does a wilderness transform into a superpower that shapes the entire world? This is the story of America. A story of discovery and destruction, of freedom and slavery, of dreams and wars, from ancient tribes to atomic bombs, from colonial rule to global dominance. In the next hour, you'll witness the rise of a nation that changed everything. You'll see how 13 tiny colonies defeated the world's greatest empire, how a country tore itself apart and rebuilt stronger, how 2 world wars turned America into a superpower, and how the American dream became both a beacon of hope and a source of controversy. But here's the question that will haunt this entire story. Was America's rise inevitable, or was it built on decisions that could have gone completely differently? Let's go back to the beginning. Before skyscrapers, before presidents, before the name America even existed. Let's go back 15,000 years. Long before Christopher Columbus set sail, long before any European knew this land existed, America was already home to millions of people. But who were they, and where did they come from? During the last ice age, around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, the Bering Strait between modern-day Russia and Alaska was frozen solid. A land bridge connected Asia to North America. And across this frozen highway, the first humans migrated into the Americas. They were hunters, following massive herds of woolly mammoths and giant bison. These weren't primitive savages. They were survivors, skilled hunters, master craftsmen. Over thousands of years, they spread across the entire continent, from the frozen Arctic to the southern tip of South America. And then, something remarkable happened. They stopped being nomads and became builders. In Central America, the Maya civilization emerged around 2000 BC. They built towering pyramids, developed a complex writing system, and created one of the most accurate calendars in human history. They could predict solar eclipses with stunning precision. In South America, the Inca Empire rose in the 1400s, ruling over 12 million people. They built Machu Picchu, a mountain city so perfectly engineered that even earthquakes couldn't destroy. Yet in Mexico, the Aztecs created a capital city, Tenochtitlan, with a population of 200,000 people. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had only 50,000 people. The Aztecs built floating gardens, massive temples, and had running water systems that wouldn't exist in Europe for another 300 years. And in North America, tribes like the Iroquois, Cherokee, and Sioux lived in harmony with nature. They hunted buffalo, grew crops like corn and beans, and developed rich spiritual traditions. But here's the haunting question. If these civilizations were so advanced, why did they fall so quickly when Europeans arrived? Curiosity hook, 4 minutes. And keep that question in mind, because the answer will shock you, and it has nothing to do with military power. It has everything to do with something invisible, something microscopic, that killed 90% of Native Americans before most of them even saw a European face. But before we get there, we need to talk about the man who changed everything. A man who wasn't even looking for America. A man whose arrival would trigger one of the greatest transformations in human history. October 12th, 1492. After 10 weeks at sea, Christopher Columbus spotted land. He thought he'd reached India. He was wrong. He had stumbled upon the Caribbean islands, and this mistake would reshape the entire world. Columbus wasn't the first European to reach the Americas. Vikings had landed in North America 500 years earlier, but Columbus was different. He came back. He told Europe about a new world filled with gold, land, and opportunity, and Europe listened. Within 50 years, Spanish conquistadors swept across Central and South America like a tidal wave. Hernan Cortes conquered the mighty Aztec Empire with just 600 men, Francisco Pizarro brought down the Inca Empire with even fewer soldiers. How was this possible? How did a few hundred Europeans defeat empires of millions? The answer wasn't just guns and horses. The real killer was disease. When Europeans arrived, they brought smallpox, measles, and typhus, diseases that Native Americans had never encountered. Diseases their immune systems couldn't fight. Within 100 years, 90% of the Native American population was wiped out. Not by war, by germs. Entire civilizations collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Knowledge was lost forever. This was the greatest population collapse in human history. But while Spain conquered the south, other European powers looked north. In 1607, England established Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in America. Life was brutal. Starvation, disease, and conflict with native tribes killed most of the settlers in the first year. But they survived. And more came. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, in Massachusetts. They were religious refugees, seeking freedom to worship as they pleased. They signed the Mayflower Compact, creating one of the first forms of self-government in the New World. Over the next 150 years, Britain established 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. Each colony had its own character. Massachusetts was religious and strict. Virginia was agricultural and wealthy. Pennsylvania welcomed all religions. New York was diverse and commercial. But there was a dark foundation beneath this new society, a foundation built on slavery. Starting in 1619, enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to America. Over the next 200 years, millions were kidnapped from their homeland, chained in ships, and sold like property. They built the wealth of the South. They cleared the land. They harvested tobacco, rice, and cotton, and they received nothing but brutality in return. Now, Britain controlled 13 prosperous colonies. The colonies were making Britain rich. Everything seemed perfect for the British Empire. But here's the problem. The colonists were starting to think for themselves. They were starting to ask dangerous questions like, why are we paying taxes to a king 3,000 miles away who doesn't represent us? And when people start asking questions like that, revolutions begin. So what pushed the colonists over the edge? What made peaceful farmers pick up muskets and fight the most powerful military on earth? The answer involves tea, taxes, and one very bad decision by the British government. By the 1760s, Britain had a problem. They'd just won a massive war against France called the 7 Years' War. They'd protected the American colonies from French invasion, and now they were broke. So Britain decided the colonies should pay for Islay, their own defense. Seems reasonable, right? The colonists didn't think so. Britain passed the Stamp Act in 1765. A tax on all paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. The colonists were furious, not because they didn't want to pay taxes, but because they had no representation in the British Parliament. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Britain backed down. They repealed the Stamp Act, but they weren't done. They passed new taxes on tea, glass and paint, and they sent British soldiers to Boston to enforce these laws. Tensions exploded on March 5th, 1770. A crowd of colonists surrounded British soldiers, throwing snowballs and rocks. The soldiers panicked and opened fire. 5 colonists were killed. This became known as the Boston Massacre. But the real breaking point came 3 years later, December 16th, 1773, the Boston Tea Party. A group of colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This wasn't a riot. This was a calculated protest. And Britain was not amused. Britain responded with the intolerable acts. They closed Boston Harbor. They banned town meetings. They forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. This was the final straw. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers marched to Concord, Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons. But colonial militiamen were waiting. The first shots were fired at Lexington Green. The shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. But here's the thing. Most colonists didn't want independence. They just wanted fair treatment from Britain. Even George Washington, who would become America's first president, initially just wanted reconciliation. So what changed? What pushed the colonies from protest to full revolution? One man, one pamphlet, and 50 pages that changed everything. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. It was a radical argument for complete independence from Britain, written in plain language that common people could understand. Within months, it sold 500,000 copies in a nation of only 2.5 million people. And suddenly, independence wasn't a crazy idea anymore. It was the only option. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it proclaimed that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Beautiful words, revolutionary words, words that inspired the world. But here's the uncomfortable question. How could Jefferson write that all men are created equal while owning over 600 enslaved people? This contradiction would haunt America for the next 200 years. But we'll get to that. First, there was a war to win, and the odds were impossible. Britain had the world's most powerful navy, professional soldiers, and unlimited resources. America, it had farmers with muskets. How could they possibly win? The first years of the Revolutionary War were a disaster for America. British forces captured New York. They occupied Philadelphia, the colonial capital. George Washington's army was freezing, starving, and deserting. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge nearly ended the revolution. Soldiers had no shoes. They wrapped their feet in rags. They ate bark and boiled leather. 2,000 men died from cold, disease, and starvation, but Washington held them together. And slowly, things changed. The turning point came at Saratoga in October 1777. American forces surrounded and captured an entire British army. This stunning victory convinced France that America could actually win, and France wanted revenge on Britain. France sent money, weapons, and most importantly, their navy. The French fleet would prove decisive. The final battle came at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. American and French forces trapped British General Cornwallis against the sea. The French Navy blocked any escape. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was over. Against all odds, America had won. In 1783, Britain officially recognized American independence in the Treaty of Paris. But now came an even harder question. How do you govern a new nation? The first attempt was the Articles of Confederation. It created a weak central government with almost no power. Each state acted like its own country. There was no president, no national currency, no way to collect taxes or raise an army. It was chaos. So in 1787, 55 delegates met in Philadelphia to create a new constitution. They debated for 4 months. How much power should the federal government have? How do you prevent tyranny? How do you balance the interests of large and small states? The result was a masterpiece of political compromise. A system of checks and balances. 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, each limiting the power of the others. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. He could have been king. Many wanted him to be, but he chose to step down after 2 terms, setting a precedent that would last for 150 years. And in 1791, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. 10 amendments guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, the press, and the right to a fair trial. America was no longer just an idea, it was a functioning democracy. But it was also tiny, just 13 states along the Atlantic coast. The vast continent to the west was still unexplored, unclaimed territory, and Americans began to believe something dangerous and powerful, that it was their destiny to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that God himself wanted them to spread across the continent. But what would happen to the millions of Native Americans already living there? And how far would America go to fulfill this manifest destiny? The answer would involve one of the greatest land grabs in history, and one of the darkest chapters in American history. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made the deal of the century. He purchased the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. With one signature, he doubled the size of the United States. But here's the catch. Nobody really knew what was in the Louisiana Territory. It was a massive blank spot on the map. So Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on an expedition to explore it. From 1804 to 1806, they traveled 8,000 miles from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean and back. They mapped rivers, documented hundreds of new plant and animal species, and made contact with dozens of Native American tribes. Their journey opened the floodgates. Thousands of American settlers began moving west. They believed in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined by God to expand across the entire continent. It sounded noble, but it had a brutal cost. Native American tribes had lived on these lands for thousands of years. But the US government didn't care. They wanted the land, and they were willing to take it by force. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands to designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee Nation was forced to march 1,000 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma in the dead of winter. No proper food, no shelter, no medicine. Over 4,000 Cherokee people died on this journey. They called it the Trail of Tears. This wasn't the last betrayal. Over the next 60 years, the US government signed over 400 treaties with native tribes and broke almost every single one. But the westward expansion continued. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas, which had recently won independence from Mexico. Mexico was furious. Tensions escalated into the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. The US won decisively and forced Mexico to give up half its territory, what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. And then in 1849, gold was discovered in California. The California Gold Rush began. Within a year, 300,000 people rushed to California, hoping to strike it rich. Most found nothing, but California's population exploded. By 1850, America stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Manifest destiny was complete, but this rapid expansion created a massive problem. A problem that had been festering since the founding of the nation. As new states joined the Union, one question dominated every debate. Would these new states allow slavery or ban it? The North and South were becoming two different countries, different economies, different cultures, different moral values, and both sides knew this couldn't last forever. One way or another, this question would be answered. The only question was, would it be answered peacefully or in blood?